Shortly after the creation of Israel in 1948, the Arab-Israeli War erupted and resulted in the Egyptian occupation of Gaza and the Jordanian occupation of the West Bank. But the violence continued. Palestinian Fedayeen carried out guerrilla attacks, and the Israelis launched a series of reprisal operations. Meanwhile, thanks to Egypt purchasing arms from communist Czechoslovakia, the Soviets began supporting and supplying the Arab nations, while the Americans, and particularly France, began supporting and supplying Israel. Tensions between Egypt and Israel flared up when President Nasser of Egypt closed off Israeli shipping through the Straits of Tiran, starting the Suez Crisis. Israel joined Britain and France in attacking Egypt and successfully occupied the Sinai Peninsula. However, after the conflict, they were forced to hand over the occupation to the United Nations. The conflict gave the Israelis confidence in knowing that they can successfully conduct a full-scale war, while Nasser emerged as the figurehead of Arab nationalism. Tensions flared up again in 1960, shortly after Syria and Egypt united to form the short-lived United Arab Republic. Israel launched a reprisal operation on the Syrians, prompting the Egyptians to mobilize their forces. And although the Rotem crisis finished peacefully, the Israelis' unpreparedness forced them to improve their military intelligence and policies. Then, into the 1960s, there was the formation of the PLO, and in 1963 and again in 1966, coups in Syria put the anti-Israeli Ba'athist Party in power. Small clashes between Syria's new government's forces and the Israelis erupted along the Jordan River in the Sea of Galilee, so they signed a defensive pact with the Egyptians. 1966 also saw Israel launch reprisal operations in Jordan. The Samu incident led to widespread protests within Jordan, putting pressure on King Hussein to respond. However, Hussein blamed Nasser for failing to come to his aid, so Nasser was also put under pressure to respond. Then, in May 1967, Nasser received false reports from the Soviets that the Israelis were moving troops to the Syrian border. Nasser responded quickly by expelling UN peacekeepers from Sinai and moved his own troops in on May 19th. Then, on May 22nd, he once again blockaded the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, even though doing so would be considered an act of war by the Americans. However, US President Johnson bided for time, not wanting to get involved in the conflict, and warned the Israelis to wait. Meanwhile, Nasser signed a defensive pact with the Jordanians, and other Arab nations began to move troops to the Israeli borders as well. Now, to remain neutral in this issue, here are two scenarios. Israel needed to launch a preemptive strike against the Egyptians in order to gain the advantage against the larger forces on their border. Or, Israel knew the Egyptians were in no position to attack, but used this opportunity to launch an aggressive war with their own superior army. You be the judge of which is correct. Either way, on June the 5th, 1967, Israel launched airstrikes on the Egyptian Air Force, crippling it while simultaneously moving troops into Sinai. Jordan and Syria responded to the call of arms, and other Arab nations, notably Iraq, sent a great deal of aid and weapons to the war effort. However, Israeli airstrikes also rendered their air force useless, so the Syrians and Jordanians responded by shelling Israel itself. The Israelis pushed into Egypt following their retreating army and captured Gaza and the entire Sinai Peninsula within just 4 days. Meanwhile, also within 4 days, they had pushed the Jordanians out of Jerusalem and forced them to retreat from the West Bank. The final 2 days were spent driving the Syrians out of the Golan Heights. Now, fearing that the Soviet Union might step in to aid their Arab allies, the United States helped push Israel to sign an armistice, but they continued to occupy the lands they had taken while the peace process was underway. The Arab states met in Khartoum in September and declared they would never recognize the State of Israel. However, as part of UN Security Council Resolution 242, an incredibly ambiguous resolution, they agreed to make concessions in exchange for Israel returning the land they had taken. However, it would take another war and peace resolution before the Sinai was given back to Egypt. Meanwhile, the Golan Heights, West Bank and Gaza Strip remain under Israeli occupation, so the Arab nations refuse to recognize Israel and the conflict continues.